Hey there friends, in this video I want to show you how you can make your own hats at home using materials that you probably already have on hand if you've been making my other patterns. The hat pattern includes two different styles. There's the 5-panel style like I'm wearing, and also a 6-panel dad cap. I'll admit these hats can be quite challenging. I've had a lot of practice at it and every one improves a little bit. They're still not perfect. The hats don't require any special tools. You can make them with a regular sewing machine, but I've got some tips and tricks to make it a little easier for you. Let's get right into it. Almost every seam in this is going to be a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I have my two top panels pinned together and I'm going to sew across the top curved edge. With that 1/4 inch seam allowance, now I need to finish these seams, and I'm just going to use a 3-thread overlock. I have the stitch width set to 5 millimeters because I'm working with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I have the needle in the rightmost position, which will make a very narrow overlock. So that overlock stays within the seam allowance and finishes both edges at the same time. With the seam finished on the top panel, now we want to top stitch it. And you'll want to fold the seam allowance towards the left side of the wearer's head, and we'll do a single row of top stitching. When you top stitch this, you just want to make sure that you're catching the seam allowances on the same side all the way down and keep a consistent distance from the edge of that existing seam. So you'll be using matching thread, but that top stitching holds that seam nice and flat on the inside and the outside. To finish the edge of the opening on the back here, I cut just a strip of the same yellow fabric. I'm gonna line it right side together, and I'm gonna sew it at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now I'm gonna rotate the whole thing to the wrong side, fold the raw edge under, and push it flat on the wrong side of the top panel, and it'll be finished on the inside. And then we'll top stitch that about the width of the tape. So I'm top stitching down from the right side of the top panel through the tape on the back. And one thing you want to do is you want to make sure that you're following the natural curve that's cut into this top panel. Otherwise it'll kind of get all stretched out and weird looking. So I really am going to follow this curve, and the tape is folded down underneath on the bottom. All right, so my tape is sewn on there, so now all we need to do is trim off the excess, and the back is nice and finished on the inside. I wanted to show you a different method for finishing the back opening of the hat. In this example, I'm going to use this cotton twill tape. I have my hat set in here for a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then I'm going to take my twill tape and I'm going to place it directly under where the needle is going to land, so I'm sewing on just the edge of the twill tape. So then all I need to do is make sure that I'm following the 1/4 inch seam allowance underneath and keeping this twill tape right underneath the needle. So I'll show you from the wrong side. You can see that I sewed the twill tape to the hat, just catching the edge there. When I roll this underneath, the raw edge of the hat is concealed, and I can just top stitch this at about the 1/2 inch point, because that's how wide the tape is. So once you've top stitched that tape flat, you can see that the inside's fully finished. The outside maintains a nice curve because the twill tape will flex, unlike grosgrain tape. To join the front panel with the top, you want to make sure they're right sides together, and we're aligning the top with the single notch on front. The double notch at the bottom is actually where it connects to the brim. So that at a 1/4 inch, now we just want to finish that edge just like we did previously. And if you find you're off a little bit, where one side is shorter than the top, it's okay. These are very forgiving. We can just trim that up later and even it out. Okay, with that finished, now we're going to open it up. We're going to fold the seam allowance towards the back, and then we're going to go and top stitch that flat just like we did on the top panel. So for whatever reason, when I sewed the front on, it didn't reach all the way to the top. That's not an issue with the patterning, it's just an issue with my sewing. So to even that up, I'm just going to make this real gradual curve from this top panel, come all the way over and meet where the front panel is. And it won't really make a difference because it's such a gradual change and fix. With that back finished, the next thing to do is sew the side panels on. And there's 2 notches on each panel. The first notch aligns at the seam where the top and the front meet. The second notch aligns to the single notch that's on the top panel itself. And you'll sew that with a 1/4 inch seam allowance following the curve of the side panel. Now a little tip here, you want to make sure that you're sewing the side panels on from the same direction. So I start from the front panel and go towards the back, and I do that on both sides. So one side will be flipped in relation to the other. With both the side panels on, now again, we're going to finish this raw edge with the serger, and then we'll top stitch it just like we did the other panels. Okay, with that finished, we'll flip it out, and then I'm gonna fold the seam allowance down towards the side, and I'll top stitch it. So I'm folding the seam allowance away from the middle seam towards the side of the hat, and I'll top stitch that down. That wasn't perfectly even, but if you're using matching thread, you really won't notice it, and it'll hold those seams nice and flat. And I'll do the same thing on the other side. So we didn't put any fusible interfacing on the hat, so if you're using the stabilizer, which will just allow the front panel to look a little cleaner, I like to go ahead and bind this curved edge before I sew it in. And a little trick, I'm using fold over elastic here. This is stretchy, but I'm not going to pre-stretch it at all. I don't want any tension on this, but I will use a seam guide. So this is a magnetic seam guide. I'll put it right on my plate here. I can use that as a backstop to help hold the binding in place as I go around this curve, and it'll give me a consistent stitch distance. And there we go, I've got a nice clean binded edge around that stabilizer, and that can get put into the hat to help it keep its shape. So now I want to sew this stabilizer panel to the front of the hat, and I'm just going to line it up on the wrong side, so it's on the inside of the hat, lined up into the center of the front panel, and I'm going to sew this on. Now I want to sew this on less than the 1/4 inch seam allowance we'll use, so it's just going to be a very close edge stitch just to hold this in place and join the two together. So that's just edge stitched right on there just to hold it in place. And what this does is you can see it gives the front panel, it'll help hold that shape of that front panel. On really light colors like this, you will see it through there, so you don't have to use it if you don't want to. I like this stabilizer panel because it's nice and breathable. You don't feel it when you're wearing it, and it doesn't make this crispy. Okay, to start the brim, I'm going to sew these 2 layers, the top and bottom, directly on top of each other, right side together, in a very precise 3/8 of an inch seam allowance along this outer edge. If you want to, you can lay the brim on there and trace the line, or you can just use a seam guide and be extremely precise at 3/8 of an inch. So once again, I'm using my magnetic seam guide. I have it at a 3/8 of an inch, and I'm just going to sew very, very slowly around this curve. And I'm also using a short stitch length. So I'm not paying attention to the line I drew at all. I'm really just watching to make sure that the 2 layers of fabric are exactly at my seam guide as I go around this. With these 2 layers sewn, what you can do is you can cut some relief cuts around this curve to help the seam allowance lay on the underside much more cleanly. I would not recommend grading the seam allowance way down close to the edge here. I would use relief cuts. So a sharp pair of scissors and just cut some little wedges around as you go. And they're spaced about every 3/4 inch to an inch. Okay, now we're going to use the brim to help turn this. I'm going to set the brim kind of in position where I want it, using the notches to help line it. Because my foam was already curving, I want all my seam allowances to be on the inside of that curve, so they're on the bottom of the brim, not the top of the brim when I'm wearing it. And here you can kind of see through my fabric to see the seam allowances on the underside, so this is the bottom of the brim. And I'll just continue to work this to where it's nice and taut inside this curve all the way around, and that the brim is also positioned rotationally inside this correctly, and that's why I have those notches on the brim and on the fabric, so I can line the center. The seam for the 2 panels is biased towards the bottom of the brim, so it's kind of even with the bottom of the brim there. And now what we want to do are these stitches, and you're going to sew through the 2 layers and the foam to hold it all together. There's a couple different ways of doing it. You can just draw a curve on here and then follow it with the machine. Once you have that one drawn, you can do as many parallel as you want just by using an even seam allowance from that line. So it can be difficult sewing these parallel lines, and that's why I've designed this 3D printed little bracket, and it can install onto an industrial sewing machine that has the mounting holes and give you even distances that you want, and it helps guide this. It's on Maker World if you want to print it yourself, and it'll really help do these parallel lines. Another hint is I'm using a walking foot attachment and again my magnetic seam guide, and we're going to go right around the edge here and see how it comes out. Here I'll go with a longer stitch length, and I'm just going to try to follow this the best I can. All right, so I sewed that brim with a regular sewing machine and just using a magnetic seam guide, and it came out pretty well. I went ahead and transferred my notches again to the center of the brim, and I'm just going to make a small cut right here, a relief cut. That little relief cut will help this fabric go around the curve as I sew it to the hat. Okay, so how do you get the alignment of the brim and the hat? What I like to do is I'll put my hat at the center mark with the brim, and it's just barely hanging over the foam, and I'll just walk that seam around to where the edge of the brim and the hat meet. And I'm going to start sewing there, and I'll sew the brim onto the hat as I go around this curve. So I wanted to show you that with a zipper foot, you can align this to where your needle will be sewing right up against the foam without sewing through the foam. So then, once that's in place, then you're going to be sewing this hat part to the brim, trying to keep a 1/4 inch seam allowance on the hat. The amount of fabric you have on the brim doesn't matter because you're going to be riding up against the foam. So here I'm not as close as I want to be, but it's currently attached and it's nice and clean. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to sew it again using my zipper foot to try to press right up inside there. Okay, so I ended up sewing that twice just to get as close to that brim as I could, and I didn't sew through the foam at all. So there's 2 rows of stitching there. I didn't rip out the original one, I just sewed it again, getting as close as I could. And now that's a nice clean finish there along that foam brim. And again, I didn't have to sew into the brim at all, into the foam. Now we're going to start on the sweatband material. My recommendation, and what I typically use, is just a piece of wicking performance fabric like a gym or exercise t-shirt would be made out of, and it's a strip of it folded in half and then sewn into it as a sweatband. It's very comfortable, it's lightweight, and it wicks moisture away. Another option is knitted or plush elastic that gets sewn into it. And then there's also the option to buy pre-made sweatband material that's made for hats, but I find this is quite difficult to install. So I'm going to show you how we make the sweatband using exercise t-shirt fabric, which anyone can do at home. Okay, to sew on my sweatband, I'm lining the serged edge to the edge of the hat. It's overhanging the back of the hat at the opening, and I'm going to sew this on at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, so I've sewn up to where the brim is, and following that 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I've taken my tray off, so I'm using the free arm of the machine to give myself a little bit more room to maneuver this. And I'm just trying to follow the foam as close as I can while keeping the sweatband in the right position. I'm also reaching underneath the hat to move anything out of the way here as I go, because this is going to want to bunch up on me. And the free arm does help a little bit. Okay, so I made my first pass at sewing the band onto the hat, including going around the brim. If I pull the band away, you can actually see some stitches, and that just means that I wasn't close enough to the foam. And I can tighten that up just by getting up in there, and you don't even have to take the stitches out. You just get up in there and sew it tighter using that zipper foot. and that'll cover up those stitches on the underside. Okay, well, it took me a couple tries and I ended up using a smaller zipper foot on one of my industrials, and that got me nice and close with that sweatband on the bottom of the brim. That looks nice, and then up top it looks pretty good. So now what you end up doing is you fold all of this around the seam to the wrong side. You tuck this excess to the back side, and then we're going to run a top stitch all the way around the hat again, but this time we're going to top stitch on top of the brim as we go around, and we'll come all the way around to the other side and finish that top stitch over here. When you top stitch this, you want to be right up on here. You want to be about 1/8 of an inch away from this seam, especially back here at the back, because we're going to insert our adjustability back here, and you don't want it to ride very high. So make sure that you're stitching about 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters away from this bottom edge. Okay, so another little tip, something you may not know about these feet. If you've ever noticed this little spring-loaded plunger back here, that's for starting on a ramp. So what you can do is you can push the front down and push that plunger in, and it'll hold the foot more flat. And as I go, I just make sure that sweatband's nice and flat and I follow the curve. Now we are sewing through a couple layers here. So there's little domestic machines. This is not their strong suit, but it'll work. If you need to, just lengthen your stitch length, and that will help as well to sew through this so you're not having to sew so many stitches. Okay, let me show you a second method for doing the sweatband, which once you've had a little practice might be a little easier. This time I'm going to go ahead and use the pre-made sweatband material. And in this case, we're going to be top stitching it and sewing it to the hat all at the same time. So what I do is I like to find the middle of the sweatband, and I'm going to place that underneath the bottom of the brim, which is already sewn to the hat, in the midpoint. And one thing that might be easier for you is if you go ahead and attach it to the brim first by top stitching it around the front, catching the band underneath. Then we can finish the sides. Once you've had a little practice, you can do it all in one go where you start on one end and sew all the way around it. But on your first couple tries, it might be best to go ahead and lay this in position and top stitch it from here to one side and then do the other side just to get that sweatband in place. So from the bottom, I want this sweatband to cover all my stitching. So I'm going to place it right up against the foam in the middle, and then put all of that down against the machine. And I'm going to top stitch one direction, then do the other direction the opposite time. So I'll place it right here, and I've got about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I'm going to curve this hat to stay in position with the sweatband that's going to go straight. You don't need to have any attachments or anything like that, because you're really just working the hat into position and sewing small segments. Okay, so with that sewn in place, I'm really far away from the edge here. And that means that the sweatband on the bottom is not very tucked in. But because that's really just kind of considered a basting stitch, now I can go and I can really get tight in there, and I can sew that all the way around and get that band to sit right where I want it. And then I can pull those threads out. Okay, so I put the zipper foot back on, and now I'm going to stitch really close right along this edge, and I'm just going to make sure that I'm catching that sweatband underneath, and that's going to really tighten it up against the brim. Okay, so now to go all the way down the end of the side, I'm going to fold my side under by the 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to lay it directly on top of the sweatband, and I'm going to finish sewing it. Okay, so we got that top stitched all the way around. And now there's a couple options for the adjustment on the back. This is like a center button quick release, and it uses a wider piece of webbing. You can find these at a lot of different retailers, or you can just steal it off an old hat. Another option I've done in the past that works great too is just a little bit of Velcro. And on this one, I just sewed some fabric to the outside of the Velcro and gave myself a little pull tab. the option I'm going to be going with is this webbing and a small ladder lock. And it's just 2 pieces of webbing that get sewn into the ends, and it works really, really well. And I like this narrow webbing. So I lost some footage, but this is all I did, is I have the 2 pieces of webbing. I first sewed in this ladder lock, and I stitched right on top of the existing stitch line. And then with about a 6-inch piece of webbing, I folded it under and stitched right on that side. And on the inside of the hat, you can see it leaves a real nice finish there. No webbing's exposed, you won't feel it at all. And this is a great attachment. It's lightweight, and I find this works really well. All right, so self-made hats. One of the things that makes them very clearly homemade is the seam quality in terms of how pressed this is. If you've ever seen an industrial video, you see that they have this mold that they put the hat over, they steam it and they stretch it, and that gives this very crisp seams. One thing you can use at home is a tailor's ham. And this is just this rounded shape like a bean. It's filled with sawdust. And this is for using to iron with a steam iron curved seams. So it's perfect for this type of application where you put it on here and you use a steam iron to press these seams. And then what I do is I really press it down. I really kind of stretch these seams to make them nice and crisp. One caveat though is we're using synthetic fabrics here, and it is possible to melt your hat. So if you can see it, there's some glare on this fabric. It doesn't come like that. This is black Taslin. And this is because I hit it with too much heat and steam. So you need to be careful and use low heat settings. Other hats have come out quite nice. Here's one that's a black Taslin. And this actually uses grid stop for the brim. My 6-panel hat, I didn't press it, but I will, because you can see the seam just has that rippling in it, and that pressing it and stretching it will get rid of that over time. This monolight makes a really nice back panel. So there's my 5-panel hat. I'm telling you, these hats are a lot of fun to make. They don't use very much material. It's probably materials you already have on hand if you've been making my shorts or jacket patterns. So I hope you try these. They're a lot of fun, and I look forward to seeing yours.